The Surgeon General of Florida, Dr. Joseph Ladapo, is the first Surgeon General to speak up against the dangers of the mRNA vaccine for certain age groups. In fact, the Florida Department of Health has now advised males aged 18 to 39 to not take the mRNA vaccine. This is also some of the same guidance that has been given by other countries in Europe. So this is based on some sound science. Joining us now to talk about it is Dr. Joseph Ladapo, the Surgeon General of Florida. Before we get into this interview, I want everybody to know that I recorded this just a few moments ago and unfortunately found that I had some technical difficulties, that my video did not record. I've had this happen once before, you might have noticed. So I will just be a smiling picture during this interview. You'll have to forgive me, but it's a great one. So I hope you continue watching. Dr. Joseph Ladapo, thank you so much for joining the show.
Hey, thank you for having me, Kim.
I'm a big fan of yours. I have to admit, before you became the Surgeon General of Florida, I was following your writings that you were, I felt like, the most intelligent, sound, scientific-based person that I'd found early on in the pandemic. You were writing articles for the Wall Street Journal, and I stumbled upon one of your writings and then just was blown away thinking, oh my gosh, this person, finally somebody actually following science and speaking the truth, and then continued to read many of your articles that you kept putting out there, and really big admirer of your work. And then you were named the Surgeon General of Florida. I know you were where I am in Los Angeles. Yeah. And then you moved to Florida, became the Surgeon General there. And I was just like, wow, okay, you know, I feel like maybe Ron DeSantis saw me tweet one day that I just loved you and thought you were so smart. I like to think that maybe, I'm sure it wasn't that at all. A lot of people were reading those articles thinking you were very intelligent. And obviously that paid off for you, thank God. So thanks for being here. I do want to bring that up, though, first, before we get into this mRNA, the vaccine, and the new guidance in Florida. But can you just tell us really quickly, what was your experience you were with UCLA, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I was a tenured professor there.
When you were putting out these articles that were so against the chorus of what people were kind of almost like hypnotized into saying, and you were speaking science, what was the reaction from some of your colleagues?
So let me paint the pre-pandemic picture. So I'm a nice guy. I like people. You know, I was a popular guy in the department. You know, nice guy. I do good work, and I took care of patients, and I was well liked in the department. And when the pandemic came, and I was working in the hospital actually the week that, and I took care of some patients with COVID the week that Governor Newsom shut down the state. I wrote the first article about COVID that was published in USA Today, basically saying, slow your roll with the lockdowns. It's not a wise policy. It's not going to get us anywhere meaningful because virus it's going to spread in a country as free as our country. And those measures that you're proposing, especially the school shutdowns and the business shutdowns, are devastating beyond imagination if they go on for anything other than a super short period of time. And actually that was received very well. And then I wrote the second article I wrote about COVID, and that was accepted in the Wall Street Journal. And that was titled, Lockdowns Won't Stop the Spread. And that was received well, as in, oh, wow, that's interesting, Joe. We didn't think of that. Oh, thanks for saying. And then after that, things started going downhill. So I think maybe the next article was something like, they titled it something cool, but it was the looming civil liberties battle or something like that. And by the time it got to George Floyd's tragic killing, and we had people who earlier in the pandemic, no, you can't protest the lockdowns. But now, right. Oh, yes, you can protest, Black Lives Matter, all this other stuff. And it was just so blatantly political. And I wrote as much and was not, I actually pulled some punches, but you have to thread a line to publish in big newspapers. Things started heading downhill further in terms of who's this guy? I thought I liked him. I don't like him anymore. I don't like what he's saying, and I basically gradually became ostracized socially, and even from an academic perspective, there were a few people that decided they couldn't work with me anymore on my NIH funded grants, and I had 4 NIH funded grants at the time, and things just, there were some people that remained friendly, but I think a lot of people were uncomfortable with what I was writing, even those people who remained friendly. But really the greater force, particularly with my boss, and was, you shouldn't, oh no, not another article. Oh boy, what's written this time? So that was how that went.
That's interesting. I mean, extra hypocritical. I mean, it was obviously, as you mentioned, hypocritical that people were against people protesting lockdowns. And then suddenly they were like, oh, but get out there. It's a public health crisis. So get out there and protest the killing of George Floyd, which was absolutely an inhumane, terrible event that happened for sure. There's no doubt about that. But the hypocrisy in what was considered public health at that time and what you could or could not do. Definitely. But then on top of it, I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, but you're Black, right? So your colleagues, then when you're writing about that and saying, from the scientific perspective, this is hypocritical. And then were your colleagues also, I'm just curious, like, so were they being hypocritical as well? They're saying Black Lives Matter, yet they're ostracizing the Black doctor who's saying to them, I mean, just pointing out the obvious of how hypocritical this whole thing is. I mean, that the whole scenario from top to bottom.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm not big on any party, and I don't mean anything against Democrats, but it is the case that they champion all these policies in their words, but if you don't, even if you're in one of these groups that they care about and think should be treated differently from other people, and we'll put that problem aside for a moment, even if you're in one of these groups, if you're not saying what you're supposed to say, you can be any color in the rainbow, you are going to be painted badly.
Right. I mean, it's just, it's them saying, listen to Black people. And then you say something, they say, but not you, except for you. Yeah. You're the wrong one. I mean, and we see that over and over, the hypocrisy. So, well, that's, to be expected, unfortunately, here in LA, I think. People turning, just the chorus and sticking with the lines and truly feeling like, no, this is how it's got to be because this is like a new religion in a way. It's really unfortunate. So let's talk about the recommendation that recently came out, Florida the Department of Health, saying that that adult males 18 to 39 should not be getting the mRNA vaccine. I'm curious, does that also extend to younger men?
We only looked in that older age group. Okay. You have a great point, though, because the myocarditis really seems to be concentrated in maybe the 16-year-old men to late 20s or so, is when the risk is highest. But it's also important to note that there's a Scandinavian study that was published in some months ago, maybe 6 months ago, in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And that increased risk with the Moderna vaccine is also present in young women. It's a lot more in men, but it is present in women also. And that's correct. We did this analysis and we found a signal for an increased rate of cardiac-related death, really concentrated in that age group. And I made the recommendation that at this point in the pandemic, honestly, we wrote it in a very scholarly way, but it truly is a little bit crazy to be pushing these vaccines on young men at this point in the pandemic, when almost all of them have had COVID already.
Right, yeah. And there are other options, I suppose, that are out there rather than mRNAs. Do you think it's, because now they're coming out with a new mRNA that includes, it also includes a flu shot and a COVID shot. Am I mistaken on this? I feel like there's one that's out now that's a combo.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's been released, but there are dozens, I think, of mRNA vaccine trials underway, and there's clearly a push to push this technology on certainly Americans and probably the world. I personally am incredibly uncomfortable with it. Just this pandemic, in terms of the gap between data and or reality and what's been presented. There's there's clearly more going on than just public health in terms of how these vaccines are being pushed, and in a way that just ignores evidence about safety risks.
Yeah.
So I'm not comfortable with the technology at all and the way it's being used. And you're absolutely right. There are multiple mRNA products that are in the technology pipeline.
Which is really, in my opinion, odd. I mean, when they released these vaccines, people were under the impression that this would end the pandemic, that if you got the vaccine, I mean, we saw Joe Biden even say this, you get the vaccine, you won't get sick. Rachel Maddow, all of these people were out there promoting it, saying if you get the vaccine, you won't spread it, you won't get COVID, you won't spread COVID. We all know that that is not the case at all. So they weren't effective in that way at all. And, I shouldn't say at all, maybe very minimally, there is some protection against spread for a certain amount of weeks, and then it's gone. It drastically fades.
Not at all. I mean, the goal was not at all achieved.
Right. So if the goal wasn't achieved, why is it then they're pushing this same technology as if, wow, this was a miracle. It was so great. It worked so well. We're going to do it with everything. I mean, that wasn't the case. So why do you think there is this push to continue using this technology that, we've had other technologies in the past when it comes to vaccines that have worked? So why not stick with the tried and true rather than go in this new direction when it didn't fulfill the promises?
That's obviously an incredibly interesting and important question, to which I do not know the answer.
Yeah.
What I know is that the intention, and I just mean God gives us all intuition, and we're tapped into it to different degrees, different people. And my intuition, as is the intuition of many people who really just innately or inherently, they've taken flu vaccines, they've done all these vaccine things, but with these, they're pushing them they're keeping them at arm's length. My intuition is that it's not the motivation is not from a place that is prioritizes sort of healthy and benevolent values or desires. It's definitely from a very dark place, just as the entire pandemic has been promulgated with really negative energy.
So are you going to get any data that would then have the public department for Florida recommend against mRNAs for those younger teenage males?
We are definitely going to keep looking. We have, because it's a great point. We've obviously already recommended against it, and you didn't even need any additional data beyond the already low risk of serious events with COVID among healthy children, and the high rate. People, Dr. Peter Doshi and others they published a paper in Vaccine that found that the mRNA vaccines had a serious adverse event rate of 1 in 800.
Yeah.
Folks that don't know much about vaccines, it might not sound high, but that's higher than every vaccine, to the best of my knowledge, that is used in the public. And not just a little bit, it's a lot higher.
Right.
These vaccines, these mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, are just much less safe than any other vaccines that we've ever widely used in the public. So there were already a gazillion reasons not to give them to healthy children. And we do have some other studies that I'm discussing with my team, some other safety studies.
I want to talk about your book. So you've got a book out, A Transcend Fear and the Blueprint for Mindful Leadership in Public Health. You mention in there that treatment became a dirty word. And I know that you wrote articles about the various treatments that people, that were out there that were then demonized. How do you think that some certain medications, certain, treatment options or therapies that were out there, why do you think they were demonized and become that dirty word?
Well, it's a complicated question because the demonizing came from not only the non-scientific community or the media, but also from the scientific community. So a community that is more familiar with data and the inherent uncertainty and limitations of science. So I think that it came from different parties for different reasons. I do think that my impression is that sort of the vaccine track, if you will, was part of it. And not even just the vaccine track. So it was the stay-at-home track, trying to get people on that, and the wear a mask track. And then eventually it was the vaccine track. So everything else was often viewed as a distraction from the main message that everyone needs to do, fill in the blank. And whatever you fill in changes depending on where we are in the state of the pandemic. And I think that is a way that tends to be a more liberal way of viewing public health in terms of liberal ideology and liberal. Actually, no, I take that back. I think that's actually an insult to liberalism. It's actually the opposite. I should say a politically liberal way of viewing the pandemic. All of government and everyone needs to do the same thing and be on the same page. So that's part of it, in my opinion. Ultimately, it was disastrous and divisive, and probably I suspect that our results, our outcomes, would have been better. And actually, no, I take that back. Our outcomes definitely would have been better because more schools would have been open without any of these mandates in this country. Yeah. Just letting communities self-regulate, because schools wouldn't have been closed everywhere. And the lockdowns and the isolation and the deferred health care and the emotional and mental and spiritual damage from the separation and the societal harms, that was that's really unquantifiable, the harm.
Yeah, it turns out Sweden wasn't wrong after all, right? I mean, when we look at how Sweden responded to the pandemic, and everyone criticized them, saying that would be they would just end up in a total disaster and it would be horrible. And they really didn't end up any differently than anyone else. I mean, and they didn't end up having to go through these drastic measures at all. And yet, in the end, really ended up the same. That people would compare them to Denmark or whatever, but then we saw, and we've seen, and we're still seeing with Denmark, they're still getting massive waves of COVID that they didn't get earlier. It's a little delayed or whatnot, but also just a very different system. Even though, yes, they're both Scandinavian countries, people were comparing them and it wasn't really quite fair. Denmark doesn't have nursing homes, for example. Sweden does. It's like there's all these other factors there. But it's interesting. We probably wouldn't have ended up, we would have been in a better position not having especially robbed children of those really important years of school, of the interaction with one another, covering up their faces so that they can't even, see expression and learn speech with mouth movements. A lot of things that happen there. Yeah. So what do you think, you're a smart man, you're surrounded by other smart people. What do you think was it, and I know you mentioned this in your book, you talk about fear and judgment being really sort of the root, what ended up getting us in this terrible position with the pandemic. Do you think that fear really overtook the intelligence of, it's just insane. The smartest people I know, some of the smartest people I know, just changed and lost all sense of science and reason. Scientists, I know actual rocket scientists who are building rovers for Mars, and they are still in a state of, I don't want to remove my mask. I'm not going out until my youngest child finally gets vaccinated. What is it, do you think, that just caused people to lose their minds?
Yeah, so I think it's actually it's a complicated discussion because my wife is my spiritual half. So she's really been our guide for our family, and so she travels in domains that I'm not as familiar with, but are very comfortable for her. And I do think there's a spiritual component from what I personally can observe and attest to. I mean, fear is profoundly powerful, and it was a bigger factor, say, for the first year or so, maybe a little bit less than that. Certainly, the first few months, and that definitely shaped how many people, probably most people in this country, viewed the pandemic and the measures that we were taking. But no, it is very powerful, and ironically, with the irony of it is that, and as you mentioned, I do write about it in the book some, like this feeling that feels very natural, when there's uncertainty and, oh, people might die and people may become sick, also simultaneously robs us of our ability to make optimal decisions, to make decisions that bring to bear all of our gifts and talents, because fear shuts all that down. And now here's the fear, and the range of thought is very narrow and very limited, and that's all you have in terms of your
Right.
resources to make decisions. So how can you make better decisions when that's all you have, when that's all you bring, when you have all of this other stuff, all of these other talents and sensations and other areas of receptiveness. Now, if you're running away from a beer, you only need this, right? It's like run as fast as you can, as hard as you can, as long as you can. That's all
Right.
you. But something like, I mean, this is more complicated, and that is part of the reason so many very, very smart, intelligent people got it completely wrong.
Yeah. How do you think we can be better for the next one that inevitably is going to show up? I don't have any thinking that this is a once in a lifetime pandemic. I just feel like there's going to be another one.
Oh,
There always are others. We
always
just
are.
never reacted this way, I
There
don't
are.
think, to the past. So what do you think we could do moving forward to prevent this again, if anything?
Well, I think that people need to take personal responsibility for themselves and their SH asterisk T. And what I mean for that by that is that, and I write about it a bit in the book, is that the most important thing in an emergency is just having your house in order as much as possible. And when I'm talking about your house, I mean your internal house,
Hmm.
your emotional being, your spiritual being, your mental being, even your physical being, and taking care of those parts of yourself, because that allows you to do as best as you can when God throws the curveballs at us, and we have to deal with stuff. And that's really on everyone. And sure, people have different capabilities, but just recognizing, for example, that, hey, they took advantage of me. I was afraid, and I took their word for these things, like not seeing my loved one in the hospital and thinking that was okay, but that wasn't okay. But that's what happens when we fall prey to fear, that we
Yeah.
lose our connection with very important parts of our being. And I think just for as many people can realize that happened to them, and and for among those people, for those who are willing to take some personal measures to try and strengthen their internal being, like that's what we need.
Yeah. Well, Florida's lucky to have you leading their public health. That is for sure. Sad to miss you, sad to lose you from LA. We needed more people like you. I was, like I said, when I was reading your articles, I was thrilled to find out you were here, and I just thought, okay, there are some sane people still left in LA, and then you left. So,
The belly of the beast. The belly
yeah,
of
so
the beast.
now I don't know where we're going to get any sanity around this joint, but Florida's certainly lucky to have you. leading them there. Ron DeSantis, obviously very bright, very smart, knows how to guide a state, and did a great job getting you there to help with that. And I thought he really was, especially when the vaccines were rolling out, I just thought, wow, Ron DeSantis even was the smartest, most a common sense governor in the rollout of the vaccines when everyone else was giving them to their first, to the essential workers, like the 22-year-old grocery bagger. Ron DeSantis was like, why aren't we giving this to our older people? Because that's who's actually affected by COVID. That makes the most sense. And it was just like common sense, looking at the data. That is one thing I love that you've been doing this entire time, is just common sense, looking at the data, making decisions based on that, even with, the latest guidance in Florida of 18 to 39 being recommended against mRNAs. That was based on data that you guys had gathered. And yet, still waiting on that data even though there's plenty of it for the younger, but you're so data-based, you're so data-based that even in that scenario, I think is a proof of that. Because I would go further, I would be, if I were in your position, which I'm not for a reason, I would be like, nobody, especially the young ones. Yeah, definitely not.
Makes sense. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't make sense. And we'll look and see what we see with the data, but no, it doesn't make sense. Yeah. Young people at this point in the pandemic, it truly is insane for doctors to be recommending these vaccines.
Yeah, but they have to, I think, especially in states like California, or risk losing their license because of laws that have been passed now. So yeah, I guess it was a great time to get out of California as a physician, right? All right, Dr. Joseph Ladapo, the Surgeon General of Florida, also author of Transcend Fear: Blueprint for Mindful Leadership in Public Health. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kim.